All right, welcome you back on Tuesday Locked On Syracuse Podcast, where we are continuing our exit interview series. This one might actually be an exit interview. We will see. Cole Swider is the topic today. Whether he's coming back, whether he's staying, we don't know right now. And with our luck, he'll probably announce it 5 seconds after we drop this podcast. But we'll talk about what it would mean if he came back, our general thoughts on if he's coming back, and recap his season. In our exit interview series today, it is Cole Swider.
Are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
All right, welcome in. Tim Leonard, Tyler Aki, and this episode of Locked On Syracuse is brought to you by Stat Hero. Stat Hero is reshaping the way that you play fantasy sports. Dozens of house-based games to play daily. No sharks, no funky props, just you, your skill versus the lineup you choose. Sign up today at stathero.com/lockedon. So we've been doing our exit interview series. If you missed some of them so far, we did Jesse Edwards yesterday. We started out last week, did Joe Girard, Symir Torrance, Benny Williams. We were kind of, I think, putting off Cole Swider a little bit, waiting to see if we'd find out about his decision, if he's coming back or not. And there's been mixed things said and written about that over the course of the season. Initially, Jim Boeheim was pretty steadfast. He's probably not coming back. Then it felt like maybe through Jim Boeheim talking to Cole Swider again, he sort of opened that door a little bit and made it seem like it wasn't as definitive that he's not returning as before. So here we are. We're recording Tuesday morning. Haven't heard anything. What's your feeling on what way Cole Swider might be leaning right now?
I would guess yes, right? It feels like all the breadcrumbs are sort of leading you that way. And we saw the tweet from Pete Moore, who's the SID for Syracuse Sports Information Director, and he sent out a message, or a tweet rather, that listed off a bunch of the players that were coming back next year / incoming players. And Cole Swider's name was on that list. Yeah. So I don't know how much you want to take from that, but there are certain players that weren't on that list. I don't believe Jimmy Boeheim's name was on that list. He's one of those players who was sort of up in the air at one point. But yeah, I think if you had to sort of take what you're seeing right now, it seems like the player's word is that he's leaning towards coming back, and some of the other signs that you're seeing are he's coming back. So I would lean, yeah, he's going to be back on this roster next year.
So I think I'm leaning no, just because I feel like he would have announced it by now. But I mean, we don't know anything. Like, I'm just guessing at this point, and I'm very interested to see if he announces it this week, what the reaction will be, and sort of when we will find out, because it is a very important decision. I think he started to play some really solid basketball towards the end of the season. If you're in his shoes, and we had him on this podcast at the start of the season or in the preseason, right after he had announced he's transferring from Villanova to Syracuse, we asked him the question, is this 1 year? Is it 2 years? He kind of made it seem like he was just going to go play at Syracuse and see where it goes from there. And he's open to whatever. And he's maintained that throughout. I feel like the question that I have is the way that he ended the season, scoring 30 plus against UNC, scoring 28 against Florida State in 28 minutes in the ACC tournament game, finishing with some pretty good stats, which we'll get to in a second here. Does that increase his chances of leaving, or does that increase his chances of staying, in your opinion?
I would guess it increases his chances of staying, because he may have looked at it as, look how I closed the season with some of these iconic performances. And what happens if I come back next year? It felt like he was just more comfortable down the stretch of his season. And you saw the performances he had, especially against Duke, the ones that he had against UNC, Florida State. Like, those were some of the best performances we saw out of a player this season at Syracuse. And I think there may be the want for more, and the want for more to do it at Syracuse, a school that he loved during his recruiting process, and obviously loved enough to pick it when he was transferring too. So I think he just felt more comfortable towards the end of the season, and I think that might be reason enough for him to come back. The question I would want to know too, and I'm sure the answer for a lot of people changed maybe in the last 2-3 weeks of the season, is do you want Cole Swider back? Is he an important piece to next year's team? And I think after those performances that he had to close out the season, a lot of people's minds may have changed. I lean towards yes, I would want him back on this team. I think it would certainly help from a veteran leader standpoint. I mean, it seemed like he was the best leader on this team. When you see the way that he took some of these guys under their wing, like, I wonder if he's a big reason why Benny is not even thinking about transferring, the way that Cole kind of guided him. Because think about things from Cole's perspective. He was a highly rated recruit as well in his own right, and he struggled out of the gate. He wasn't getting a lot of playing time out of the gate. And I'm wondering how much of that he imparted on Benny and said, hey, just sort of stick through the process here, at least give it a couple years. You never know. And obviously Cole transferred, so his story is a little bit different, but he stuck it out at Villanova for 3 years and then said, okay, now is my time. And in all honesty, Cole probably got screwed over by the COVID extensions for some of these players and probably was going to step into a larger role at Villanova, but because some players were returning, didn't have that opportunity. So it was in his best interest to move on, but he did stick it out for the longest time there. And I wonder how important that is going to be in his decision, that I can come back, I can be a real leader for this team next year, and I can be a guy who maybe even can lead the team in scoring for next season too.
Yeah, I think it's tough because he really has two options. It's go pro or come back. It's not like he can go to another school because then he'd have to sit out now that it'd be a second transfer. So there's no other option outside of, all right, I'm going to start my pro career now, or I'm going to come back and try and expand my stock, basically grow a little bit as a player, and then I'll try playing professionally, because I'm sure he wants to at least try it out playing overseas or
and
wherever.
He'll play pro somewhere. Like he's a good enough player
for sure. And I don't know if there's really the part that scares me is I feel like when you're on the fence about these type of decisions, an important thing to consider is, all right, is the team going to be good next year? Is it going to be worthwhile to come back? And this team next year might be a little bit better than this past year, but it's not like Buddy, Jimmy, and him are in it together. And we already know Buddy and Jimmy are definitely not coming back. So that makes it, to me, feel like there's less of a chance, because usually when you see guys come back that you weren't expecting to come back, maybe that were on the fence, it's almost like a group thing. Like when Florida won the national title, all 5 starters said, you know what, let's all run it back together. And they buy in together. And the fact that Jimmy and Buddy are moving on, Barama's obviously moving on, it makes me feel like he's probably done. Don't know anything. Wouldn't shock me one way or the other. But as it stands right now, I feel like him starting his pro career this year is probably just best for him versus coming back. I get it. He could maybe average 19, 20 next year, but it's not like they're going to make a run at the national title, if we're being honest about next year's team.
But would he want to be a fixture on an NCAA tournament team? Like, he played in a couple games at Villanova but he could be a starter on an NCAA tournament team. And he may say, I might be one of the key pieces to this team getting to the tournament next season. And I wonder if he's got that craving for it. And again, it's not like his status as a pro is going to change between this year and next year, right? It's not. He's going to play professionally. It's just a matter of, does he want to do it now? Does he want to do it next year? But I'm with you. I think he's either coming back to Syracuse or he's going pro. I don't think there's a transfer. Yeah. And I think he might be able to do a grad transfer, so he would be eligible immediately. I'm wondering if that's, again,
I don't know his credit situation or right.
Well, he's had 4 seasons of college basketball, so I don't know exactly how the grad transfer thing works, especially after this one-time transfer rule all got passed. But I still think he's coming back. But it's, if I were to pin a percentage on it, I'd probably go 65-35 right now.
Okay.
I could see it happening the other way too, where he just wants to move on. Because again, I would have thought Marek would want to come back too. I would have pinned Marek's chances of coming back at being even higher than Cole's chances of coming back. Now, I guess the one external factor with a guy like Marek was he wasn't from this country and maybe wanted to go back to Europe, play overseas, a little bit closer to home, because he hadn't again, the pandemic really sort of played a factor in all that potentially. So I wonder if that's another thing. Like, hey, maybe he's just ready to move on. Some guys are just ready to move on. That's just
Right.
the nature of life.
Yeah, I'm probably 65. He doesn't come back, but I mean, really, it's just a total gut thing.
Would you want him
You
back?
could what?
Would you want
Oh,
him back?
I'd love to have him back. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think he'd be a key part of next year's team for sure. And they need shooting.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if they need it, but it's been an integral part of the roster the
I
past
think they
couple years.
do. Like, you
Yeah,
think about some of the pieces that you're going to be losing from next season, and this
they
is a
just
team
need
that,
veteran guys
yeah,
too that have been in the system for a little bit
I
and
think you need a
now
leader.
qualifies.
And Cole Swider is, I think, the definition of the leader that you would want on this team heading into next season. I mean, you look at your potential options. You're losing two really strong ones from this season with Barama Sidibe and Buddy Boeheim. Those ones are gone. So who's next? Who's going to step up next? I mean, we've had our questions about, can Jesse Edwards step up and be a leader of next year's team? I think your candidates right now are Joe Girard, Samir Torrance, but he's kind of a newer piece to this team, as is
Right.
Cole. But we saw Cole do it this year, and we saw Cole be a very vocal player for this roster. So I would love to have Cole back just from a leadership standpoint, and obviously the production is going to follow too. I think he'd be primed for an even bigger season after having the workload that he did this year.
All right, we will dig into his stats a little bit more, recap his season, look ahead to if he is on the roster next year in just a little bit. But I don't know if you're like me, you maybe had Kentucky in your Final Four and now your bracket is busted. Mine is not looking good, but I still got some cash for my Stat Hero Pick'em. If you haven't checked out this new platform, you're really missing out. Stat Hero's NCAA single game Pick'ems pits the star players against each other in an amazing hybrid between fantasy and sports gambling. You take control back from those handicappers that always seem to have the advantage. You start focusing on the players you know best with a gameplay that doesn't rely on big spreads, long odds, or funky props. They simply post sets of players for you to take on with a set of players you choose. Stat Hero is the easiest and fastest way to get your sports action fix. It's a simple, sleek gameplay that'll have you playing in minutes, and this is what daily fantasy was meant to be. So sign up for free right now at stathero.com/lockedon. Use promo code LOCKEDON for 100% deposit match. That's stathero.com/lockedon. Promo code LOCKEDON for 100% match. Some serious savings. stathero.com/lockedon. Promo code LOCKEDON, all one word. Terms and conditions apply. So his stats, looking through him, and I get it, he played 35 minutes, so it's a little bit easier. We can say that right off the top to rack up some pretty good stats here. But if you would have told me at the start of the year these would be his stats, I would have guessed his approval rating, his sort of legacy, all that would just be a little bit higher than it is right now, because not only was he very effective, he was also pretty efficient. 14 points per game is what it ends up being, right around there. About 7 rebounds per game, which is more than I would have guessed, probably.
I think that
He
was the most underrated part of his game too,
Yeah,
his rebounding ability.
right. And these shooting splits, 44, 41, 87. So 44% from the floor, 41% from three, which really rose as the season progressed and we got deeper into ACC play. And then 87% from the foul line. He's a good shooter. We knew that, but I was a little surprised even how good those shooting splits ended up. I think we've gone through most of the players now and gotten to their stats, and most of them have been, pretty much around where I thought. When I looked at his stats, I almost did a double take and was like, man, he had a really good statistical season.
Well, the thing that maybe made it feel that way was he didn't have a lot of good three-point shooting games in the non-conference. I'm looking through right now. He only had 2 games where he shot better than 40% from 3 in the
Yeah,
non-conference slates. 2 of 12. And he came in as a dead-eye shooter, which just kind of shows you how good he was in conference play this year, shooting the basketball. We saw some really, really strong performances out of him, especially down the stretch. A lot of people are going to remember that UNC game where he goes 7 of 11 from deep. And he couldn't miss that night. It felt like
right.
he was having a night. And unfortunately, it resulted in him fouling out. But those numbers, again, I don't want to say it was Girardish, because I definitely think Cole had more like B type of games. And what I mean by that is if you're grading him, he had some B games in there, but he certainly had some A games along the way, and he had some F games along the way too. And that can be the nature of guys who are dead-eye shooters. Sometimes it's just not your night. Sometimes you struggle from the field on a given night. But it was a little Girard-esque at times, where there were nights where he could not miss the bottom of the bucket, and there were nights where he couldn't find the bottom of the bucket. So again, that's one of the things that I'm looking for with, and this could be something that with Samir maybe getting some more run to next season. How can he set up these two, Girard and Swider, if Swider's a part of the fold next year?
Yeah, to your point on the up and downness, you just go back and look, even late in the season, home game against Duke, which we all know how that went. It was over right from the jump and a 97-72 loss, but he was 0 for 1 from 3. He was 1 for 4 total in that game. He put up 2 points, just wasn't really a factor. Only played 14 minutes because that was a good Benny game. But then he follows it up, and literally 2 days later, he goes on the road at UNC and has the 36 point, 7 for 11, 3-point performance in 43 minutes. Even the second time around against Duke in the ACC tournament, an okay game, but he's playing 38 minutes, finishes 3 for 11 from 3. So it felt like when the competition, the defense was a little bit tighter, kind of like Girard, he struggled a little bit more. But the difference is Girard was up and down throughout the season. With Cole, it really was the more he got comfortable in the zone, the more he got comfortable in his role, kind of like Alan Griffin a little bit last year. I know Alan Griffin ended the year bad, but they were two guys that came over as good 3-point shooters that now have the ball in their hands more, and they just had to figure out how to get to the basket, how to get to their spots, because they hadn't really done that at the college level yet. And it was a really rough start for him. I remember after the VCU Battle for Atlantis game, he played well in the last 2 Battle for Atlantis games, but VCU, he was 0 for 7 from 3. Colgate, he was 0 for 4 the game before that. Those were back-to-back losses where we were on here like, man, he's got to play better than what he's done. Yeah. The difference is, though, that I think comparing him to Girard, he just got better and better as the season went along. It was a little bit inconsistent towards the end, but still the highs were better than they were before. So overall, still an upward trend throughout the season.
And I think maybe it was the volume that was messing with him a little bit. Maybe he wasn't expecting to get the amount of, maybe I shouldn't say expecting the amount of run that he got, but maybe he just wasn't used to it too. Mm-hmm. And in the early stages when he's playing 30 something minutes a night, he hasn't done that since high school. So that's a lot to kind of adapt to here. I look at it too. I think he also started to take advantage of the fact that he was a guy who could shoot over the top of some of these smaller defenders. I mean, he was a 6'9" guy who was playing sort of the 3 for Syracuse. When you look at the type of defenders that often were checking up on Jimmy Boeheim, he was a 6'9" guy who was usually guarded by a guy who was no taller than 6'7". And I think towards the end of the year, he really started to take advantage of that. And it kind of gets into the question of whether or not Cole Swider was the X factor for this team. And the more and more I dig through it, I think it 100% was the case. You look at the games where he scored at least 18 points for this Syracuse team this season, the Orange was 8-2. And those 2 losses were the UNC game, which was just a collapse, right? Like that was a game Syracuse could have had, especially if Cole Swider maybe doesn't foul out of it too. Sure. And then the other was the Miami game, the first Miami game, where they were up 18 once upon a time and collapsed. So you could easily have been 10-0 in games where Cole Swider scored 18 or more points. And then on the flip side, in games where they had, or where he was in single digits, so 9 or fewer points, it wasn't pretty. They were 1-7. So you just see the duality of man there with Cole Swider. When he was going, this team was fantastic. When he was not, this team really struggled. They needed him in these games where they were going bad. Like look at some of these games that they lost where he scored in single figures. You had the Pitt game that they lost. You had Colgate. You had the VCU game, which you brought up there. The second Miami collapse, he wasn't very good in as well. So if he was playing well, this team was winning games. If he wasn't playing well, the team wasn't winning games. I shouldn't say playing well. I should say scoring, because there were games where he wasn't scoring well, but he was doing some other things well. He was getting rebounds. He was getting some steals. But they need this guy to score the basketball if they're going to have success next year. That's part of why I really want him on this team, is because I think he can bring that consistency to another level. And let's say he does average 18 points per game next season. Again, that's asking a lot. That's asking for a 4-point bump from this previous season. But if he can get going and he can get you some of these 20-point games, we see that it leads to winning. They need Cole Swider to score.
Yeah. All right, we'll put a pin in our Cole Swider conversation for just a second. It's that time of year again as college basketball tournaments are finally upon us. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline.net is the number one sports source for all of your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcast, and news this season. Not just basketball, they are your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information needs, including live betting. They even have your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today. Use your mobile device to sign up if you want to go about it that way. You can learn more about the trends and action. Bet Online, where the game starts. And I know we've both been dipping into Bet Online over the course of the NCAA tournament a little bit, which may be for better or for worse, depending on what day of the week it was when we were doing that. But sticking with Cole Swider, I also think it's important to note that his offensive rating on KenPom, a stat that we shout out a lot, and I don't think it's a perfect stat, because if you are if you're a guy that doesn't shoot as much, you just inherently get a better rating. It seems like Jesse Edwards had far and away the best one this season on the Syracuse team. But Cole, amongst the other guys that are all kind of in the wing creator role, was the best offensive rating. And it made me think, really, he's not a guy that forces shots. His offensive rating, by the way, 114.8. In conference play, it was 113.5, which is the 22nd best in the ACC, just looking at just conference games. That's a solid number. And there were a lot of games where he finished like 4 for 5 from 3 or 4 for 6. And we actually got on here and said, you know what? I'd rather Cole be shooting more, but he's a very good shooter like Buddy and Joe. He also just doesn't really take any bad shots. Whereas I'm not saying Buddy forced shots, because a lot of times there was just not a lot of guys that could take shots on our team besides Buddy. But there were times that Buddy forced shots, and there were times that Joe definitely forced shots. And it felt like Cole never really got into that category as much. He just maybe was not used to that role as much as the other guys.
And another thing that plays into the offensive rating here is turnovers. And one thing that he did a much better job of towards the end of the season was taking care of the basketball. I know a lot of people will point to that Miami game that Syracuse collapsed in, and he wasn't very good at taking care of the basketball. He wasn't very good at scoring the basketball in that game. He had 4 in that one, but outside of that, he rarely had more than 1. Once you got into conference play. And that's an important thing. And again, I wouldn't expect a guy like him to turn the basketball over a lot, because he's not a guy that's going to be doing a lot of driving. If anytime he's really putting the ball on the floor, it's usually in transition is when you would see it. So I trust him. I've gotten to that point. That's how I felt towards the end of the season. I trusted him. And I just remember some of those early non-conference games, he'd have open shots, and he would flat out miss them. And some of them weren't even close. Some of them were ugly misses too. But once he got acclimated, once ACC play started to roll, he was a lot more comfortable. And you saw a lot of his numbers boosted up come ACC play. Like even his 3-point percentage jumped from what was a solid number already. But so you look at his totality of his season, he shot 41%, but he shot 44% in the ACC. So a good number got even better once you went up against conference foes. And maybe that's just a getting comfortable thing for him. It just felt like he was more comfortable at the end of the year.
And it goes back to your point of why he is the X factor, because it feels like once he started playing well, the team started playing well. And when he was playing poorly at the start of the year was when Syracuse hit some of their lowest points. And even if you want to dive into it deeper, it felt like Syracuse's only good spot in the non-conference was a little stretch sort of towards the end of Battle for Atlantis, and then tailing into Indiana, Florida State. And Florida State was a big game for him. He struggled in the first half, the road game at FSU in December, but he came through in the second half. He did have, I think, 5 turnovers in that game, but he ended up with 16 points and was a pretty big part of hitting some big shots. So it's interesting that basically as he went, the season went. Do you think, we'll end with this, let's say that, maybe this is it for him and maybe he moves on. Was it a success adding Cole Swider in the transfer portal? Because I'm pretty torn on that one. I think his individual numbers, the more time passes and the more we look back on it, we'll say, man, that guy was actually pretty good. But at the same time, the season going below 500 and him
Yeah.
being a part of the only losing season makes it hard to consider him a success, because we're also just talking about his offensive numbers. He was a part of the worst defense we've seen here in a really, really long
Yeah.
time. Not the only reason why they were bad, but he didn't really gel defensively quite as good as maybe some people thought, at least early on in the 2-3 zone, too.
Yeah, I thought he got better towards the end of the season, but overall, was he a success if this is it for him? I think it's a move you make again, but
Yeah.
maybe you make some of your other moves a little bit differently, right? I think that's the way to sum it up here. I don't think Cole Swider was, quote unquote, the problem for why this team. Now, did he contribute in some ways to the larger problem of defense? Yeah, absolutely, he did. But it's a move I would definitely make again. If there was another Cole Swider out there, or let's say it was his first time transferring again this offseason, and this is the production that I knew I was going to get, it's one that I think I make again, but it would definitely trigger me to make some different moves as well, getting more athletic on some of the other wing spots, and getting more athletic probably at the guard spot as well to help out a guy
Yeah.
like Cole. So overall, yeah, I'd probably do it again, but you definitely, it would influence some other stuff that I would want to do.
Yeah, and if you're talking, did Syracuse win the portal between losing Quincy and adding him? It's kind of a silly discussion, but
Yeah.
I think I'd rather have Quincy Guerrier. I know he struggled at Oregon. I know a lot of fans have moved on from him and are going to throw out the Oregon stats in my face. He was kind of battling an injury towards the end of the year, but he was starting to shoot better towards the end of the year from what I gathered out there. And I mean, he was an all ACC player at
Yeah.
Syracuse.
I mean, that's the argument right there is, was
Yeah.
Cole Swider an all ACC player this year? No.
No.
Was Quincy Guerrier an all ACC player in his last season with Syracuse? Yes.
Right.
So that it's over there. That's where the
Yeah.
argument ends.
And he provided less shooting, but he also provided more athleticism.
Better
His
defense.
rebounding numbers were pretty similar to Cole, so say what you want about that, but he maybe would have worked better with this team. Now, maybe the better comparison is, would you have rather had Alan Griffin or Cole Swider? That one is pretty much a toss-up for me. Alan Griffin also had some good numbers that when you look back on it, maybe gets wrongfully accused of being bad when he was actually pretty integral and made some big plays, the Buffalo block, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And actually, that's probably a better comparison because they could end up both being 1-year imported transfers that had to expand to a bigger role coming from a power conference school and then sort of moved on and weren't on very memorable teams. Alan Griffin's team did happen to go to the Sweet 16, but he wasn't really a big part of the Sweet 16 run.
Right. I would say in terms of that swap, I would probably lean Cole.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that, like, the leadership qualities, I never saw that out of Alan Griffin. I just think that they were similar players, but the off the floor stuff with Cole, I liked the leadership that he brought. Whereas Alan Griffin, it didn't seem like he was the leader. And I don't think he necessarily had to be the caliber of leader that Cole was too. So maybe it was in him and he just didn't do it. But I would have rather had Cole than an Alan Griffin. That I think I can feel pretty confident. Because think about if Cole was on that team that went to the Sweet 16. Then you're talking about,
Right.
I think that team, I'm not saying they're Elite Eight or Final Four by any stretch, but I think they win more regular season games, and they probably aren't on the bubble either, because Cole was a guy who was really strong towards the end of the year. And like you said, Alan Griffin kind of fizzled. And I think about it from this lens too. We never really saw Cole get benched. We saw Alan Griffin get benched quite a few times.
Yeah. Alan Griffin's stats are pretty good too. I'm just looking at him. 43% from the floor, 36% from three, 90% from the line. He played less minutes, 29.3 minutes in his 1 year, started every game but one, finished with 13 points, had 6 rebounds, which is pretty good for the position and the height that he was playing at. They're really pretty similar, honestly.
Yeah.
And I think their legacies will end up being pretty similar. Now, the difference is Cole might come back, and that would change how we view Cole Swider probably, because I'm with you. If he comes back, then it's a different team next year, and he's probably one of the best bets to be leading this team in scoring next year.
I'm with you. And that's part of why I want him back, because where is all this offense going to come from next season? I would guess this team gets a little bit better defensively, maybe even a lot better defensively, because that wouldn't be saying a whole heck of a lot, really moving from the top 200 or top 250 to the top 100. But I think this team needs some offense, and I think that's something Cole can do, that he can certainly bring. And I also think that when you look at a guy that I just think got overall better as the season went on, I think part of that equation was his defense got a little bit better too. At least he's going to be a little more familiar with it next season, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more help on the other side as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, follow the show on Twitter at LO_Syracuse. Subscribe to the show if you haven't already. We'll be back with another exit interview tomorrow. Frank Anselem is on the agenda for tomorrow. Another guy that we were maybe sort of waiting to see if he had a decision. His less sort of pressing decision, I'd say, compared to Cole Swider. Hopefully Frank is back. We have no reason not to believe that. And we'll evaluate his season and what is next for Frank Anselem. That'll be tomorrow's podcast on the Wednesday edition of the Locked On Syracuse podcast. And we will talk to you guys then.